This episode may have some audio issues, but it is a pilot, so bear with us. We will get that sorted out in later episodes. Welcome to the FediHost podcast, a show covering the challenges of building a new internet. I'm your FediHost host, Paige. Do you like that joke? Victor, our CTO.
Hello.
Hi, Victor. So, Victor, I understand that you're not a big fan of podcasts.
That's correct.
Now, why is that? What's wrong with this particular format?
It's always like these two random guys that just talk, and you're like, why should I listen to these people? Like, why?
Yeah, well, we're not really doing a good job of breaking that mold, but I think maybe those guys have interesting knowledge of things that are highly niche.
Is that right?
Well, okay, here's what I'd propose. Why don't we do a podcast that is the podcast that you think is worth listening to? And we can just check in each episode that you're on and make sure that we're reaching those high standards.
Those high Victor podcast standards.
We're now a year into running a Fediverse hosting company. And I was thinking today we could create the podcast that you wish you could have listened to a year ago. So this is Victor in 2023 would find this podcast really relevant.
If we do our job correctly.
So let's talk about hosting Mastodon today, what the challenges are and the things that you discovered going into this project back in, it's like December 2023, right? That you first started.
We first talked about it in December, and then I told you, like, well, let's do it after Christmas. That's pretty much when we started.
Because you never work over Christmas, right?
That's right. That's a hard rule. My brain just turns off. It's not even, like, you can't even force me to work. It just doesn't work.
We better get this podcast done pretty quickly then, because we're coming right up on Christmas. Yeah. So back in end of 2023, what had you heard about Mastodon?
I'm pretty sure I didn't know a single thing about what Mastodon was. I didn't know what the Fediverse was. I had, like, it wasn't even on my radar, I'm pretty sure. I think that maybe, like, the name was slightly vague because there was, like, this Twitter Exodus wave from, I don't even remember when it was, like 2022 or something. It's when Elon first bought Twitter. People started, like, saying, let's go to Mastodon. And I think that's, like, the only time I actually heard the name, but I never bothered to look into it. So I pretty much knew nothing about it.
And I remember meeting up with you, and I just finished making my Mastodon video. And I was like, you should watch that video. I think you might like this thing. Do you remember your first kind of like investigations into what Mastodon was after that?
I remember being kind of confused about the whole like server things, and now how if you want to follow someone, you have to click follow and then go to your server to follow them on your server, things like that. It seemed a little bit weird, but also kind of exciting. Like, it was this new thing, and I knew like there was something there, even though at first I didn't really fully wrap my head around it. Like, I could tell like this was something special.
And you're kind of always been an open source, open internet.
Do you think that's why that's like something that interested me, or?
It's certainly why I suggested starting a business with you. You know, starting businesses is really hard. And so you got to have like more than just some basic like, oh, business is fun. You almost have to have the ideology, you know, to get you through the difficult parts. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely why one of the reasons that I contacted or thought of you. Cool. I do remember like you went away kind of with your homework, you know, to like look into it. And then you came back and were like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think the homework was basically just set up your own Mastodon instance and see how it goes.
So you're at the point where you got your head around like how to use it as a consumer. Now you had to start getting your head around how to do DevOps, you know, what it would look like to run the servers and stuff. So what were some of the surprises that you had when you were looking into it?
I think the first surprise was to see how kind of resource intensive Mastodon was. It runs on Ruby, and I don't know how technical we want to get in this podcast, but essentially Ruby is very resource intensive. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's just the way Ruby is, and it was very resource intensive. So when I was thinking about, okay, well, how can we host this in a way that's gonna like, how can we keep it cheap for people to host it, even though like the base usage of Mastodon is really high, things like that. And then some other challenges which kind of apply to everything we host was figuring out how do we provision all these new instances that we pop up, like to many different servers as we grow, because we can't just have one machine and be like everything goes on that machine. Well, what happens when that machine's full? Like you need a mechanism to send it somewhere else. And I think that was kind of like the biggest hosting challenge, was figuring out a way to create this infrastructure that could basically host any new service that we wanted without having to worry about like manually setting it up or saying like, well, you go there or you go there. Oh no, this server's full. We need to manually say like, oh, this server, you can't use it anymore. Or a really big thing about Mastodon is certain like configurations that you can't do yourself as like an admin on Mastodon. You need to have access to like the back of the server, where a normal sysadmin would usually go in and type in some like command lines. But those commands were actually very useful for somebody to manage their server. So it was figuring out a way also to expose those commands when we needed to the user, so they could take those decisions that you would normally have to go in the back end and type in those commands, but make it easy for someone that doesn't know how that works to just say like, well, I know what I want to do, and there's this command that does it. Well, you don't have to think about the command. You just think about what you want to do, and then you do it.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds to me like because Mastodon is so is resource intensive, the issue of needing to manage lots and lots of servers was more pressing than with other software you might be just experimenting with, because you knew immediately, oh, this is going to need a lot of servers. Where like, oh, I don't know, a lighter thing like a WordPress website or something like that, you could be like, well, I could probably put like 30 on one server.
Contraries are like maybe a normal company where you have a website that offers a product, and then you can have like 1 million users on your website, and it's probably fine. 1 million is too big of a number, but let's say 1,000. You could have a website with 1,000 visitors a day, and it could run on a really small machine, and it wouldn't really care. But Mastodon, it's such a big thing out of the box that like a single user, maybe you got like 5 instances on a server, and that's it. Like depending how big your server is. And for most people, it's when they want to self-host it, is even like getting the smallest maybe server from like DigitalOcean or AWS. That's still like too small for how big Mastodon is.
When you talk about it being resource intensive, like I don't know what the the DevOps term of it would be, but there's kind of a resource usage profile of different services. Like some use a lot of RAM, some use a lot of hard drive space, some use a lot of bandwidth. Like what is the resource usage profile of Mastodon versus some of the other Fediverse services that we host?
It uses a lot of RAM compared to Peer2, where Peer2 basically uses nothing unless it's encoding. And then it needs the RAM to cache like different video parts when it's doing the encoding. But besides that, Mastodon uses a lot of RAM all the time. And then depending on how, like if you do a post or something like that, it might use some CPU, but so far it hasn't been that crazy on the CPU side. Like we're always really low on CPU usage.
I know that like it's popular to blame Ruby, but GoToSocial uses a lot of resources too, right?
It surprisingly started to use a lot when we updated to 0.17. I suspect it's because they changes their SQLite database implementation, which apparently the new release that's coming should lower the usage again. That's something we still need to look into, because there's basically two databases you can use when you use GoToSocial, and I'm trying to figure out what the best course of action is. But even then, compared to Mastodon, GoToSocial is extremely light in resource.
Like, what are we saying? Like 50%?
More than 50%.
So I think it's fair to say that a lot of Mastodon's resource usage is the way that those services interact with Fediverse. They're busy, right? Like ActivityPub pushes a lot of stuff out to instances if you have a number of users following a lot of stuff.
I think the philosophy of Mastodon is to kind of be the default that does the most things for users. So by trying to be, I guess, maybe playing nice with everybody, it ends up doing more than, let's say, GoToSocial that's more focused on kind of doing its own thing. Because Mastodon has this kind of status of needing to kind of be the one. I don't know if maybe like Mastodon devs would agree with this, but I think they kind of have a responsibility to inform good Fediverse practices.
They've got interoperability with a lot of things, and they are trying to have good coverage of what you need to access for Fediverse. So like you can see a PeerTube video on Mastodon. You can see threads, so yeah, they got a code for that. And then in the end, like GoToSocial, they did not set out to recreate Mastodon in a different programming language. It's intentionally more cut down and more like oriented, it seems, towards like single user instances. And like, does GoToSocial have the ability to follow relays in it, for example?
I know it's planned, but they don't have the option yet.
Yeah, so like that, I remember when I was first using Mastodon, I was like, oh, I'll add some relays so I can see more stuff on my single user instance. And it filled up all of my hard drive space immediately, just not understanding that that's what it would do. And that was what was my constraint. It wasn't my RAM or my CPU.
I think you bring up a good point with storage, which I didn't bring up, but storage is actually probably the biggest thing that our users face when they join like FediHost and make a Mastodon instance, is they go like, oh, okay, I can't actually follow everything because then my storage gets filled up so quickly. So
it's like everyone could potentially have multiple terabytes and have a copy of everything on the Fediverse from the last month, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, I think, for users to have to consider what they value and being like, do you really need to see like 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Do you really need to have potentially the data for everything that's on mastodon.social? I think it's a common mistake that people make when they start out, but I don't really blame them. I mean, it does seem like not a terrible way to spin up a smaller instance, is like add some relays and pay a little bit more for like the first month to kind of follow people more conveniently, and then scale your storage down from that point on.
See what you like, and then scale down.
Cast a wide net, and then like reset your storage down to the level that you actually need. Okay, so some of these things, if anyone's watching this, are only applicable to if you run a Fediverse hosting company. But I think a fair number of them, these points that we've made over the last 10 minutes or so, are universal to anyone wanting to set up a Mastodon instance or play around with it. So when it comes to the things that you've tried to kind of change, or you'd like to see change with Mastodon, I know you've submitted like a few pull requests, which is the programmer word for code change suggestions to for Mastodon repo. What were those, and why did you submit them?
So I think for Mastodon, I only submitted one. I think it was just one. It was a pretty simple thing that was important for people hosting their images on something that we call an object storage. So basically, instead of storing images, video, whatever media on an hard drive on your computer, well, the computer being where your Mastodon instance is running, you send it to some other service like Amazon S3 or in our case, it was Backblaze. Before the code submission that I did, Mastodon only supported allowing your instance to store data in a specific bucket. So the way object storage work is they have a bucket, and then that's kind of like a folder, maybe, if you want to make it simple. But Backblaze, the way it works, would rather that you have few buckets and more like prefixes in those buckets. So like subdirectories in your bucket. And Mastodon only supported specifying a bucket. So I had to go in and submit a code change to say, well, can we allow people to specify a prefix so that way you can have multiple instances all run on the same bucket, but they're going to be separated by those little prefixes. And they ended up merging it because Backblaze is actually quite cheap compared to AWS. So, and I think like a lot of people do use Backblaze for object storage, and it was just a nice thing to have, to be able to prefix different instances in the same bucket.
I guess some of what's going on is we're early adopters on some of this stuff. You know, I mean, we're hopefully we're early adopters of doing a podcast about the Fediverse. And what happens when you're doing that is you're like kind of the first one through, being like, hey, this would make it a lot easier for people building infrastructure out there to implement. You know, so hopefully we have a good relationship with the people writing the code. You know, because there's got to be a back and forth there. To try to make the Fediverse just easier to do. You know, it is easier for us, then it'll be easier for other people doing the same thing, and even people who are just hosting it themselves. So finally, if you could go back in time, Victor, to 2023, what would you tell yourself when it relates to the hosting of Mastodon specifically?
What would I tell myself? I don't know, Paige.
This is what would make the podcast really valuable for you, because you're listening to yourself in the future. And so if you, back in the past, were like given the recording and you hit play and it said, I don't know, I think you probably...
That's why we're editing the podcast, so I can tell you I need to think about it. I did think about it, and I'm like, well, for Mastodon specifically, it would be kind of hard to say, but I can tell you that going down the route of trying to do like Docker Swarm instead of just going straight for Kubernetes, because Mastodon, honestly, it was pretty straightforward. It's like, I don't remember a thing where I went like, holy fuck, I need to, like, I don't think I went down a wrong end with Mastodon.
And compared to, like, it is fairly well documented compared to other services out there. Yeah. Mastodon's like, it was actually, like, it's a big thing, but it's fairly, like, if you know what you're doing, it's a nice time to set it up. Well, this brings us to the tight end of our little recording here for our pilot first episode. Thank you for listening or watching if you're out there on PureTube. Victor, would you say this has so far been a useful podcast for young Victor? Right.
I'll have to listen to it. Hopefully I did a good job.
Still a podcast skeptic? Haven't won you over yet? Well, maybe we'll get you on the next episode, Victor.